Presence. Some people have described presence as coming awake from a deep slumber, waking up. And the reality is that waking up is hard, especially when we were in a deep sleep. Presence, when we think about it, often is about time and space. It's about attention and engagement. It's about slowing down and becoming aware. A lot of times when we think about presence, we think about it taking work. But the reality is that we're always present to something. Even in our sleep, our mind is aware of the thoughts and the things that we were present to throughout the day. Even our body is present. I mean, has anyone ever eaten some weird pizza and experienced that in the middle of the night? You know what I'm talking about. The question is, what are we present to? What are we giving time and space to? What are we giving attention and engagement to? What are we slowing down and becoming aware of? And is it life-giving? Is it yielding the results that we want? Is it giving peace? Is it giving life? Is it giving joy? Is it giving fulfillment? Or does it add to our anxiety and our worry and our depression? And does it actually steal away life? That's the question of presence. Where's it going to? And what's the outcome? For many of us, our presence shifts constantly from moment to moment. I mean, think about all the things that you have to be present to in a day. You've got to wake up. You've got to figure out what clothes to wear. You've got to figure out what's going on in the day to know what clothes to wear. You've got to figure out what's for breakfast. You've got to figure out how do I get my kids out the door. You got to figure out what do my kids need for the day. You've got to think about what does work need from me today. You got to think about what does work need from me a week from now. You got to think, what groceries do we have? What are we having for dinner? Do I need to go to the store today? Do I need to pick up something home? What are all these text messages that I need to reply to? What about all these emails? What's going on Facebook? What's going on in the world? We're filled with many, many things that we allow ourselves to be present to, and they're not bad things. It's a part of life. The question is, what are they doing to us? You see, there was a time that I was really struggling to be present to the present. And it's because my mind was always in the future. And so I would walk around the house and I would leave plates out, I would leave dishes out, I would leave dirty clothes out. My wife would call me the living tornado. Sometimes if I'm with my kids, it will require my son to be like, Daddy, 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 3 times for me to begin to respond back to him. Sometimes it requires my wife to say, Justin, please respond to him before I become present. And that's a problem. That's a problem. And it's because I'm always thinking about what's next, that I'm never really here. And the biggest fear of my life is that I'm going to live my life and I'm going to be 80 someday and I'm going to look back and I'm going to be like, I missed it. I was in such a hurry to get here and I missed it. Maybe for you, it's different. Maybe for you, you struggle to be present to the present because the present is so overwhelming. And so you do everything you can to avoid the present. So you go to podcasts, even podcasts about God, or you go to books, or you go to TV shows, or you go to music or Instagram or news articles or online discussions, anything to block out what's happening around here. The reality is, whatever we allow ourselves to become present to, it will affect our behavior. It will affect our health. It will affect our mental well-being, and it will affect those around you. How are you doing? How are the things that you're allowing yourself to be present to affecting your life and the lives around you? You might have even spaced out right now in this video, and I want to invite you to come back in and be present for just a second, because I want you to see how God is present to us. Because I think a lot of us believe that God is far, or that God isn't as near as we think he is, and that God requires a lot of summoning, and that to be present to God requires a lot of work. And what I want us to see is how God is incredibly near and is incredibly present to us, and what good news that is for us, because that's the beginning of growing in more presence in 2021, is understanding the presence of God. So come with me on this quick journey through the Bible as we see how God has been present to his people from beginning to today. Okay? So in Genesis chapter 1, we see that God is incredibly present to the creation of the world. In Genesis chapter 2, it says this. It says, the earth was formless and empty, and darkness covered the waters, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Some versions say brooding. Some versions say moving across the waters. You can just imagine this globe of water and darkness and God's Spirit hovering over it. Just all of that creative energy just about to go into creating light and life and breath and spirit and just everything that went into creation, just sitting there as potential energy. The beginning, God was incredibly near. In Genesis chapter 3, we see that God is walking in the creation. He's enjoying everything that he made. He's with Adam and Eve. And then we see Adam and Eve sin. And we believe that this breaks relationship with God. And it does. And Adam and Eve get sent out of the garden. And God's presence doesn't seem as near as it once was. Instead, throughout the rest of Genesis, God shows up in certain places and certain times to certain people. For example, Hagar runs away from Sarah and all of her abuse in Genesis chapter 16. And she cries out to God, and God's presence comes incredibly near to her in that space. And it's so near that it actually renames the place. And the place becomes known as the living one who sees me. She encounters God in such a way that she says, the living God of the world has seen me. Can you imagine the peace that that would give her heart in troubled time? Know that that is true today, that God sees you. Now, when we move to Exodus, we see that the idea of who God is, or the idea of the gods, has kind of changed. There in Exodus, there's a bunch of gods. And all these gods live in a certain place, because presence is about time and space, which means it's about places as well. And so where do all of these gods hang out? Where do they live? They live in the mountains. Each god is believed to have its own mountain. And so we can't be surprised when we're in Exodus chapter 3 that Moses is a shepherd and he comes across God on God's mountain. Maybe you've never seen this before. In Exodus chapter 3, verse 1, it says this. It says, now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, of his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Where do we see God's presence in Exodus? Where does Moses encounter God? It's on God's mountain. So when Moses encounters God, it's not through some random mountain on some random desert. It's God's mountain. God's doing something on his mountain. And when Moses takes off his shoes because the ground is holy, it's not because the ground just magically became holy. It was always holy. It was God's mountain Moses is waking up from a very deep sleep. Moses is becoming present to the presence of God that had always existed in that time and in that place and in that space. Now the amazing thing is that God sends Moses and he brings the people out of Egypt and he brings them naturally to his mountain and he gives them the law on his mountain. And instead of leaving the Israelites to then go wander in the desert, what does this God do? He does something insane, something unheard of. He leaves his mountain and he goes and lives in a tent. Now, I don't know about you, but mountain tent, like I'm choosing the mountain every time. But God leaves his mountain and he becomes near. He becomes present to the people of Egypt, the people of Israel, as they travel in the desert. God comes near. Fast forward to King Solomon, and God's residence takes up a temple, this time on a mountain in Jerusalem called Mount Zion. This is where God's presence is. It's glorious. It's filled with smoke. God's presence is there, and that's where God's presence lives for the time being. But over time, people forget about God's presence, and they don't believe that God is near, and they begin acting that way. And eventually, the nation of Israel is captured, and they're sent into exile, and the temple is destroyed. Now, eventually, they're able to rebuild the temple, but God's Spirit and his presence, it doesn't come back like it was. Those who are alive for the first temple and the second temple, they're like, it's just missing something. It's not like it once was. And so people begin to ask, where's God? When's God going to show up? And it's here on a December night that the heavens open wide and the angels rejoice, singing, glory to God in the highest and on earth peace. For born to you this day in the city of David is Jesus Christ the Lord. And his name is Emmanuel, which means God with us. God with us. God has come down and his presence has come to fill the earth. And this Emmanuel, this Jesus, he gathers people around him and he begins to heal them and he begins to set them free. And he tells the people around him that they will be able to do great things, even greater things than this. He tells them that they will act as God's presence to the world. And that his Spirit will come and live inside of them. And it happens. Paul, in the letter to the Corinthians, says, do you not know that your body is a temple? Paul is not telling them something new here. He's reminding them. He's like, do you not remember? Do you not know that your body is a temple to the living God? Do you not know, do you not remember that God's presence doesn't live in a building? That God's presence doesn't live in a tent or in a mountain, but that he lives within us. That the time and space that God lives in is here in our bodies. He lives in us and he lives in you. In the book of 1 John, John writes, he says, greater is he that is in you than he who is in the world. We have overcome. Jesus says, take heart because I have overcome the world. In Genesis chapter 2, God forms us out of the dust of the earth. And up until that point, we're just these dust bags. But then the God of the universe breathes all of this creative and life-giving energy and spirit and presence into us, and we become alive. You see, God is as near to us as our breath. God is present to us. We began this video by saying God's presence is about time and space. That presence is about attention and engagement. that it's about slowing down and becoming aware by coming near. What I want you to know is that our God is with you right here, right now, at this time, in this space. That his attention is fully on you. And that he is deeply engaged with who you are. God is not in a hurry. And he is fully aware. He's aware of the needs that you have, the worries that you have, the fears that you have, the dreams that you dream, and the distractions that you have. And in all of that, he is near. We just need to be like Moses and wake up from our slumber and become present to the presence of God that is already here. Because when we do that, everything will change. God has done it. He is near. We just need to wake up. And when we wake up, our lives will be transformed. There is this space when Moses is on the mountain and he's no longer a shepherd. He's no longer a fleeing convict that has to hide from his past. He doesn't have a stumbling tongue, even though he says he does. But before God, in God's presence, God calls him child. A child of God who is made with a purpose. And that purpose was to carry the presence of God with him for the sake of freeing and blessing a nation. You see, we are the church. We are God's lived presence to the world. But we cannot live as God's presence until we become present to him. So I want to invite you here in 2021 to take time, to make space, to pay attention, and choose to engage, to slow down, become aware, and wake up to the presence of God who is already near. Because he wants to transform your life around you. He wants to set you free from the anxiety of the future. He wants to set you free from the pain of the past. And he wants to clear up the drudgery of the present. And instead, he wants to replace it and fill you with more power, with more peace, with more vision, with more perseverance, in order that the world and the people around you might be changed for his glory and our joy. God bless. May his peace and presence be with you always.